to Angel's Musical Point of View. I'm your host, Angel Naphtali, and with us today, we have live and direct New York's finest, known as the General, Mr. Glenn Grant. He's a reggae drummer and music producer for Mass Pipe Productions. Rated in the top 10 reggae drummers group, we want to give a warm and blessed welcome to the General, Mr. Glenn Grant. Glenn, welcome to our show, and please tell us about.
Welcome to Happiness and the City. This is Barbara, and we'll continue our focus on thinking, because we need to have our minds focused on heritage of the great world civilization. And in that heritage, we have amazing things, wonderful things, beautiful things. So we need to have understanding of those things in order for us to have standards. And today I wanted to talk about standards and the concept that is connected with standards, that is standard of virtue. Because there is a lot of criticism throughout the whole world, but that criticism is not grounded on standards or understanding of virtue. And most of those criticisms that I looked at in many sources, most of the criticism comes from a feeling that is fleeting. So people think that because they feel something is bad, it really is bad, but not necessarily. Let me give you an example of when we think that we feel that that person we are speaking to is not educated, that feeling may be wrong. We need to use our mind to ask a question. Are you educated? And then when we hear the answer, we analyze that answer through our mind, and we realize that that feeling we had was wrong. So thinking is logos, is connected to our minds, and we need to know how powerfully different they are from the feelings that are accompanied by often temporary ways of trying to understand another person or situation. Let me go back to my beloved Wikipedia, where I recommend you to search for things, because they are the embodiment of what I believe is the need for us to be better informed before we condemn something or criticize something. So, before we actually go to Wikipedia itself, I'd like to read you the definition of virtue that you can find on internet. Google it or Bing it. Virtue is behavior showing high moral standards. It may be goodness, it may be virtuousness, righteousness, morality, integrity, dignity, rectitude, honor, decency, respectability, nobility, worthiness, purity, and many more. And in traditional Christian angelology, the concept of virtues are actually connected with those being embodied in angelic beings. And it's called the seventh highest order of the ninefold celestial hierarchy. So we see that the concept of virtue is not only human concept, but also divine concept. So it's complex. And another wonderful definition here is from dictionary.com, that virtue is a particular moral excellence, the virtue of tolerance, and of the cardinal virtues like prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Or theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. Virtue is any admirable quality, feature, or trait. So we see here that virtue in this particular definition is the virtue that shows difference between cardinal virtues of human law and theological virtues. And we need to have that understanding within us that theological virtues and cardinal virtues are not the same thing. And when we have order of those things, then we also have peace between people who know both cardinal virtues and theological virtues, but there are also people who only know cardinal virtues. I assume here that if they knew theological virtues, they would know the difference between cardinal virtues and theological virtues, because faith itself would tell them the difference. And there are many other definitions. Let's now start with what Wikipedia teaches us about it. And here we have a wonderful painting that I want you to see. Cardinal and Theological Virtues by Raphael, 1511. So you see how the church was teaching people difference between cardinal and theological virtue by imagery, what today we have on YouTube and Facebook and many other places, in which we learn by vision, by looking at things. And here you have the definition: virtue, Latin virtus, ancient Greek's arete, is moral excellence. A virtue is a trait or quality that is deemed to be morally good and thus is valued as a foundation of principle and good moral being. Personal virtues are characteristics valued at promoting collective and individual graces. The opposite of virtue is vice. So in this particular fragment, Wikipedia focuses more on moral excellence. I focus virtue as more than moral excellence because of the way the word moral is used. It's connected with cardinal virtues, with focus on human relationships. Whereas for me, the deep understanding of virtue is much higher. We may have political virtue, which is political excellence, and people who have that are not necessarily people with great relational standard. Many may have many girlfriends or some other things happen in their lives, and yet they have excellence of virtue in politics. The same in employment, in academia, and many places of the military, of the police. And I think that we need to have that expanded understanding of virtue, because today there is a very limited understanding of virtue. And I think that when we come back to the knowledge of how complex systems of virtue are in our heritage, in what is within us and what is developing within us, and then in the larger scale, what is in the universe and in the kingdom of God. When we developed sophisticated thinking about it, we develop patience with ourselves and with our neighbors. And that leads to virtue of tolerance. So I think that today, more than at any time in the history of mankind, we need to develop in our governments, in our security forces, in our institutions, corporations, in the global thinking and national thinking, we need to develop sophisticated understanding and knowledge of complexity of diverse virtues. And then before we make an opinion to destroy somebody, we'll look at the virtue of that person's accomplishments in excellence of what they've done in a great way. One of the most complex people in the history of mankind is Catherine II, who used to be Tsarina of Russia at the end of the 18th century. And as history books show her legacy, you see how many amazing things she did in her life. Though she had some unfortunate situations in her personal life. But when you look at her whole story, you see how many amazing things she did for Russia. For 34 years, being the leader of Russia, she gave Russia the right direction and created a lot of institutions that are of great virtue who still are in Russia. If by today's standards she would be approached as somebody who did a few things wrong, she would just be destroyed. So when we look at what is happening today, we see that a lot of those standards are so destructive that they are not virtue in themselves, which leads me to the concept that standards have to have understanding of complexity of diverse virtues. In some ways, it's bringing to attention the fact that we do not have to start all over with the concept of virtue, because throughout thousands of years of human history, those standards have been created, and we need to learn them before we continue with new standards. So clearly, in a connection to the concept of standard is the concept of vice. But vice, again, has many complexities. A person can be virtuous in 99% of his or her life and has 1% of vice. Let's suppose that that vice is using dirty words. And I have many people who do that. So if you judge that person only by the foul language that comes out from that person's speech, you would think that the person is bad, but then the same person would go to Texas and volunteer time and help all kinds of people in great pain and misery. So I would look at the whole of the person, not just at the fact that some dirty words are used by the person, while the person at the same time is an extremely virtuous person, even exhibited the higher form of virtue, which is charity. And today, a lot of our conversation is about charity love. There is love and there is no love, which is no charity, hate. So before we get to the concept of charity, we have to understand that it comes from a high level of virtue, from divine knowledge of what love is, and that many people do not know that. So when you call them loveless or haters, they don't know what you are talking about, and then they really start resenting those words. So the alternative would be to have prudence, to have wisdom, and to deal with many situations that arise in our daily life through wisdom, and then to promote and teach charity, because then we will have a knowledge that charity wakes up within us something that is magnificent, that raises us to the level of divine love. So I will continue with this article that I recommend that you read on your own. Once again, you can Google it, you can Bing it, you can Yahoo it. It's on all the major search engines, and it's a very clear, wonderful exposition of this very complex concept of virtue. And I really stress that before we talk about vices, we have to know what a virtue is. Because so much talk today is just about vice, as if this was the only standard of behavior. But vice, the concept of vice, has no meaning, makes no sense if we do not relate it to the concept of virtue. And the concept of virtue is evolving. There are certain things that are connected with virtue that are universal and timeless. Those would be theological virtues. But human life throughout the ages had to deal with limits of living relationships, and certain concepts of peace and virtue were developed just to have tranquility. So let's continue with this article, because it really is so beautiful in the way it trains our mind to think beautifully about those concepts of virtue. The four classic cardinal virtues are temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. Now today, there's this focus on justice. When you go to look at diverse speeches, at different political actions, you constantly hear about justice, justice this, justice that, and it is very important. But what about temperance? What about prudence? What about courage? And those are virtues that refer to patience, to understanding that we have to have wisdom about human relationships, and also that we have to have courage to live. Some people lose courage to live. They get very sick and depressed. So courage is a virtue And when focus is only on justice, some can be so overwhelmed with guilt that they lose will to live. In other words, they are being punished for something that is just a small guilt. So we have to have understanding that justice is also about the right measure. Temperance is often used to the vice of heavy drinking or heavy drug use. But temperance is a concept that is also connected to thinking about the right measure in all the other aspects of our lives, and that includes justice. Let's suppose someone was insulted by a harasser, and that insult so offended that person that his or her face is just sunk and acts offended and eyes go left, up and right, and the speech is pouted. They don't want to talk, they don't want to hear. So they exhibit symptoms of lack of temperance. If they look at the whole picture and the whole story, they realize that that was a very small encroachment, that it really was not worthy of response of such overwhelming face of being offended. We have this in many situations that in some highly accomplished employees had to be terminated from their jobs because of that lack of temperance of somebody in the company. The better response would be to create a situation in which a person would have a way to deal with that face of being offended, to bring in healing to this feeling of being offended. And that leads me to the concept of healing virtue. Healing virtue is a system in which we can heal instead of trying to find recourse to justice or vengeance or anger or rage, because healing virtue is not only referring to personal health but also to social health. So in Christianity, the concept of healing virtue of healing, is connected with Jesus Christ himself, who is God manifest in flesh and blood, and he came to the earth to bring the divine understanding of healing virtue of healing, virtue of health. So when we understand that healing virtue brings healing to the face, brings healing to that offense in the face, this offending anger, then we may ignore most slights and criticisms and bad things that happen around us, because we have this power within us that is healing us from those offenses, and then we can focus on high level virtues like virtues of faith, virtues of hope, virtues of love, charity, virtues of knowledge of God, virtues of developing our intellect, of developing wonderful relationships. So I encourage you to read that article, because in this article also you have a lot of concepts of virtue from other civilizations. I tend to focus on European American civilization because I know a lot about that, but there are other civilizations that also developed sophisticated knowledge about virtues. And I encourage now the whole world to focus on those concepts, because when we develop concepts of virtue, within those concepts is virtue of wisdom and healing. So a lot of bad things that are happening in the world today will be resolved before they come to anger or rage. And this is what we really need more than at any time in the history of mankind today. So let's look at this. You see the plan of this article: ancient history, classical antiquity, religious traditions. You have samurai virtue, philosophers' views, contemporary views, and then at the end, vice is opposite to virtue. So I encourage you to read that article, and we'll continue our philosophical reflections on those extremely important topics.